Chapter 11, Research, Evaluation, and Assessment. The learning objectives for this chapter include considering the importance of research and some of the major types of quantitative and qualitative approaches to research, and how to examine and discuss one's research results, and how the human service professional can use research in their field. The second learning objective is to examine formative and summative types of evaluation, define needs assessment, and learn how it's different from evaluation, and learn how the human service professional will use evaluation techniques in their profession. Learning objective 3 is to define assessment, including the clinical interview, informal assessment, personality testing, and ability testing. Learn how the different types of assessment are applied, learn how basic statistics are applied to test interpretation, understand test worthiness, including validity, reliability, practicality, and cross-cultural fairness. And finally, to understand how the human service professional can use these assessments. Learning objective number 4 is to understand the concept of informed consent in research and assessment, the importance of conducting research ethically, and the significance of proper interpretation of test data when understanding assessment results. And the final learning objective, number 5, is to understand how research assessment is always evolving and can help lead direction in new ideas and procedures. Conducting research. Some of the ideas to consider when conducting research include analysis and recording of observations, answering questions about the world, confirming hunches, statistical analyses, and coming to conclusions. At the very beginning of the process, the researcher needs a hypothesis or a research question. In some master's programs, a thesis is required, and in most doctoral programs, a dissertation is required. Many times in these fields, when people conduct research and students are completing their thesis or dissertation projects, they start by asking themselves some burning questions. What are the questions that keep them awake at night? What are the questions they want answers to? What are questions that they can add to their field of study to expand the knowledge not only of themselves, but of other practitioners, other professionals, and other scholars in their specific field? The hypothesis, the research question, and the literature review. What is the difference between a hypothesis and a research question? In short, the hypothesis looks at differences between groups or relationships among groups, whereas a research question considers relationships among groups or describes events or conditions. In many types of research, the hypothesis is used for quantitative research studies, where a research question is more commonly affiliated with qualitative research studies. Another consideration is before you develop a research question or hypothesis, you must review what has already been written in the area of exploration. This means there is much literature, articles, and research studies that have already been conducted in many fields. In order to be able to create a hypothesis or a research question, the scholar practitioner must be familiar with the major themes that have already been presented in the field they're studying. They must also be aware of what are major publications that have come out related to their topic. And finally, they must understand where there are gaps in the field, where the field agrees, where the field disagrees, so they can better create a question that will help answer an unanswered question that still exists in their field. When doing this, they need to review professional literature and articles. Many times, students and scholars and practitioners will use databases such as ERIC, PsycInfo, EBSCO, If you're not familiar with the library at Houston Baptist University, I strongly consider spending some time exploring the database and the many resources that are available through our institution. Another consideration is finding peer-reviewed articles when possible. In addition to peer-reviewed articles, in many of the research classes that are taught at Houston Baptist University, students are required to find articles that were published within the last 10 years related to their field, so they're looking at the most up-to-date research possible. Another consideration is to identify variables. Variables include characteristics, attributes, or traits that can be measured. These variables usually are in hypotheses and help define the terms that are being explored and the relationship between the terms. Variables are used and measurements are used to help formulate a hypothesis or research questions. Defining quantitative and qualitative research designs. Quantitative research is looking for an objective reality. It uses the scientific method and it finds variables and measures them. Many people like to associate quantitative research with numbers because many times the scales, surveys, or instruments that are used in qualitative research produce a number that is associated with a particular attribute, variable, or trait. There are observable variables, ones that are everyday observable, that when multiple researchers are looking at a specific variable, they can agree whether the variable occurred or not. But there's also a level of variables called latent variables. And latent variables are variables that are not readily observed, but are rather observed through another variable. So an example of a latent variable might be love. While love might be an emotion that we identify and is a common experience for many of us, it is not something that we can measure directly. But we can measure some observable variables related to love. For example, pheromone levels, hormones, heart rate, skin temperature, eye dilation. All of these have been associated with people that are experiencing love or infatuation. And so while the latent variable love may not be able to be measured directly, we can indirectly measure some aspects of love through some observable variables. Another type of research is qualitative research, and there are multiple ways of viewing knowledge through qualitative research. Many times qualitative research includes immersion by the researcher into the situation, and while they are in that situation, it allows the researcher to give possible explanations for the topic they are researching. And there are broad types of analyses for the problem within its context. Some examples of qualitative research include ethnography, narrative, phenomenological. Many times we find qualitative research includes things such as interviews, focus groups, or long-term observation within a specific culture or group. There is a table in the book, table 11.1, and on that table it delineates the distinctions between quantitative and qualitative research. Some of the topics discussed on this table include assumptions about knowledge, research methods that can be used, biases and validity issues, goals and generalizability, and the role of the researcher when conducting the research. It's a very helpful table, and I recommend spending some time looking over the table and understanding the differences between quantitative and qualitative research methods. A few examples of quantitative research design includes the true experimental research design. In this research design, there are independent and dependent variables. There's a random assignment of participants. Also, with this type of research, the researcher can infer causal relationships. There's a stronger relationship, meaning one thing causes another. And there's a reflection exercise, 11.1, where you can explore this type of research in more detail. In the causal comparative ex post facto research, there's an examination of intact groups. So there's no random assignment of the subjects to specific groups. You cannot infer causal relationships, and this is mostly due to some assumptions that need to be met before we can look at causal relationships, including random assignment. And an example is to measure the satisfaction of 100 human service majors at 4 different kinds of jobs 1 year after graduation. A few more quantitative research designs include correlational research and survey research. In correlational research, it's a simple correlational study. It looks at the relationship between 2 variables. The predictive correlational studies predicting scores on one variable from scores on another variable. For example, predicting grades on an exam based on how much students study. One example of a correlational research is R. And the interesting thing about correlational research is there is a ceiling and a floor. The highest correlational value is 1. The lowest correlational value is -1. And you can see more about that on page 264. And when we talk about the R, or the correlational value, if there is a perfect correlation between 2 variables, meaning as one increases, the other increases at the same rate, that is a perfect correlation of 1. If there is no relationship between the 2 variables, the correlational value, or R, would be 0. And if there is a negative correlational value, a perfect negative correlation value, meaning as one increases, the other variable decreases at the same rate, that is a -1 correlational value, correlational coefficient. So strong correlations generally are 0.8, 0.75 and higher, or -0.75 and lower. And we go from there to moderate to weak correlational relationships. And so when you look in different research studies and read different articles, you can look at the correlational coefficient to figure out how strong the relationship is between 2 variables. There are different types of correlational studies. 2 examples would be Pearson or Spearman, and there are 2 different ways to look at correlational relationships that exist between 2 variables. With each correlational research design, there are certain assumptions, statistical assumptions that must be met in order for the researcher to be able to conduct a correlational research design. Another quantitative research design is survey research. Many times this involves questionnaires being gathered and gathering information from participants. And many times the internet is used to conduct this type of research. Survey research also obtains information from respondents, and the researcher is able to examine the frequency of responses and the differences between groups. For example, do males and females complete the survey differently? An example of survey research includes the survey of attendance in counseling found that 75% of human service practitioners, educators, and students have been in counseling, with women seeking counseling at a higher rate than men. Qualitative research design. An example of a qualitative research design is grounded theory. In grounded theory, the following information is provided. Grounded research theory is a process in which a broad research question is examined in a multitude of ways that eventually leads to the emergence of a theory. First, come up with a series of questions that can be asked of the population, which is the basis of forming your theory. For example, how are helping skills developed in human service work? This research may be conducted through interviews. You may interview a number of human service professionals and eventually come up with your theory. And the process involves preparing, data collection, note-taking, coding, which is looking for common themes in the notes that you've collected, and writing a final theme emerge, and you write up your findings. Two more qualitative research designs include ethnography and historical. In ethnographic research, also called cultural anthropology, there is observation, and this generally occurs through immersion in a culture and observing it as part of or participant in a culture. This includes interviews and collecting of documents and artifacts. In historical research, this is a systematic collection of information to understand past events from the contextual viewpoint. This includes primary and secondary sources. A couple things to consider are oral histories that are passed down from generation to generation, documents that can be reviewed and collected, relics, and there's more detailed discussion about historical research in exercise 11.3. Examining results. In quantitative research, results are generally produced through statistics, analysis, and probability. When you're looking at the differences between two groups, such as the differences between males and females, you can use t-tests, ANOVA, correlation, and probability levels. In survey research, you can use descriptive statistics, which include measures of variability, central tendency, percentages, and frequency. And the validity of assessment can be high if you have a highly controlled study. For qualitative research, results are generally produced through inductive analysis, where you look for emerging patterns, themes, or data categories. Coding, where you take interviews or interactions and you code them to look for specific types of behaviors. The review of data and drawing conclusions, and the difficulty of obtaining reliability and valid results. The importance of triangulation and the importance of bracket. Discussing the results. With all research, it is important to conduct the research ethically, and at the end of the research study to draw some conclusions based on the results and the data that has been gathered. When reading research, articles, manuscripts, and books, practitioners and scholars should be wary of the saying that you have found the truth. Many times it is important that researchers who conduct research do not overstate their findings, but they state their findings in context of the study that was conducted. Why is research useful in human service work? It helps human service professionals understand professional articles, find ideas that may be useful for working with clients. It provides validation for human service work that is being done and suggests suggestions of new ways to help clients. There are also suggestions of new avenues to explore when providing services to our clients. And it allows the human service professional to understand and undertake important aspects of research in the work that they do, including program evaluations, to evaluate the work that's being conducted, the efficacy and the importance of the work that's being conducted, and the importance of making changes that are beneficial to the clients that we are serving.